Hi, I got some requests to do a tutorial on foliage. Now, I think this is too broad of a subject to cover in one video, so in this video I'm going to focus on tree lines and forests that you can have around your roller coasters, paths, scenery, pretty much anything. And I'm going to keep it to one climate, the most common climate probably, that is that you find in Northern Europe and North American areas, where, you know, most of the theme parks are located that people usually like to build on Roller Coaster Tycoon 3. And first, I'm just going to show how I normally do it, and then afterwards we'll look at some examples, and that's how this video will just roll. And when it comes to foliage like this, what I mean is generally you'd have a forest around your park, but sometimes just around one roller coaster, and that's kind of what I want to show how I usually do this. It's sort of made up of 3 steps. The first step is to create a basic tree line. The second step is to add the normal trees that you would see that kind of function as the forest looking trees. And the third step is the infamous ground shrubbery. Now what I mean with tree lines is... Wait, one issue in Roller Coaster Tycoon 3 is that you sometimes see this enormous green plain, and even those little background hills that I currently have turned on don't really look too amazing, and they're kind of immersion breaking. So what you want to do is you want to have this enormous green plain to be invisible, and it isn't exactly realistic, since a normal forest would just have loads of trees and not really as much of ground shrubbery as you would have it in Roller Coaster Tycoon 3. But since you can't build an entire forest without spending hours on that, you kind of have to cheat the system a tiny bit. And I would actually recommend doing it like that, since it does save you time. But yeah, I'll skip to what we're actually going to do here. Usually I take the hickory tree and just kind of lower it like this, place it from a, well, small distance from the track. It really depends on where you want your forest to start, but I usually like to keep a few trees next to the track as well, so a distance like that is usually good. And make sure that if you look at it, you don't really see what's behind it. And this is what's going to keep you from seeing the empty green grassy plains that we have in the game. And don't worry if it looks terrible at this stage. This is all going to be covered in such a way that it doesn't look as unrealistic anymore. Some people like to use the sugar maple for this, since it is slightly smaller. And if you have some smaller foliage in general, it works better. And on the other hand, if you have larger foliage, I would suggest going for the normal sugar maple, since as you can see, this is a really large tree, so you can pretty much block the entire view with this. The only reason why I don't really like to go with this one is, as you can see, it's got a slightly less dark and less detailed textures, so I always like to go with the hickory. In any case, that is the tree line. That is pretty much how that works. Then after that, you can kind of fill in the forest in a way that you want it to be. And this really comes down to your opinion, or whatever type of look you want to go for, and it doesn't really matter as long as you keep it to a couple of trees. Some people like to spam many trees at the same place, but even though I would suggest using as many trees within one park as you can, don't use too many trees in one place, since it just kind of looks unrealistic, and no real park is going to put all that effort into their foliage on the side of the park. I really just feel like going for the sycamores over here. In my opinion, Gardening 2.5 is the set with the best looking trees for this kind of thing, though N7's, what's called Ornamental Trees, is also a really good set. It really just comes down to what you like most. But yeah, at this point you kind of just want to fill in the basic scenery in a way that you want to have some simple trees that we can later add the ground shrubbery to. I might want to add a basewood, not really sure about that. Yeah, that actually looks pretty good. And this is kind of like the way that I usually like to build foliage, and that I think is also the best way to do it. But like I said, there is no given sort of tree that you need to use, or certain combination that you need to make. It really just comes down to what you think looks best and works best. But make sure that it doesn't look too dense, so that you don't place too many trees next to each other, but also make sure that you don't see what's behind it. That's the most important thing, because having that enormous green plain behind it and being able to see that is really immersion breaking. One thing that I always like to get is Spices Trees. Even though this is one of the oldest foliage sets out there, it actually is still pretty good. And I always like to have some birch trees on the outside of my forests. Really just a bit of an opinion right there. I just think these look pretty cool. And another really good set is, like I said, Ornamental Trees has got some really good stuff in here. These trees are really large, so if you want to have a really high tree line, I would say go for these trees, but I don't think they really fit too well over here. So right now I already have 3 types of trees placed within this spot, and I would say about 4 or 5 different types of trees just to make up the basic tree line is what you'd want to have, not any more than that. So I think I'm gonna add just 1 extra tree, see what I can do with that. Yeah, let's see. Actually, I might not want to do that. No, I'll just keep it like this, and you don't really have to worry about it looking too repetitive at this stage, since adding the different types of ground shrubbery is what's going to make this look a tiny bit less boring. So I would say some more base woods should finish this off pretty well. There we go. And at this point, it still looks pretty boring. Like, there is nothing to look at the ground, and I would dare say actually that the ground shrubbery is the most important part of the entire foliage department. So it's time to get into that stuff. When it comes to this though, you might have noticed that I like to start off with the big things and then start doing the small things. This is mainly because it is best if you kind of work around it that way, so that you can place the ground shrubbery after you've already placed the other elements like the larger trees, so you can place the ground shrubbery around that accordingly. But when it comes to ground shrubbery itself, I would always suggest starting off with the largest things and then working your way up to the smallest things, the last of which is going to be the grass, but I'll get into that later. Now, something that some people can actually recognize my kind of foliage style for is the fact that I always like to place these large trees around the sides. These large trees around the sides. I don't know, I just kind of like those things. Little blue spruce over here. Don't want to place too many of these things. Don't want it to look like a miniature pine forest. And that's like the bigger things. Now, one thing that I really like is this thing. It is not exactly a fern, but what many forests have is they have many ferns basically on the ground. And even though this isn't exactly a fern, it does kind of emulate it in a way. And I'm pretty sure it is a type of fern, just not the exact type of it. I'm really digressing here. So I always like to place these on the sides, and what this does is you basically don't see that weird tree line as well anymore. Like, if you really pay attention to it, you can see that it's there, but you don't really notice it anymore. But it still keeps you from seeing that empty grassy plain behind all of this. So yeah, I kind of like placing these. I would say though, if you place stuff like this, do use different heights, because as you can see, if you use too many at the same height, it starts looking very not so organic in a way. So kind of want to have a little bit of variation in that. It's hard to really see it though. There we go. I would like to lower this one as well, and that should be about fine over there. There we go. And that just kind of creates a little nice tree line like that. Still definitely not done with the ground shrubbery though. There is a lot of variation you can use for this. I'm not going to go into that in this tutorial, but I would say just get as many as you can, just get as many sets as you can, and just kind of experiment with these smaller shrubs that are in there. There aren't any really small shrubs in Gardening 2.5, however there is some really amazing stuff in this set. For example, the apple trees can be lowered and be a small bush like that, which is another tip that I would like to give. If you can't find the exact bush that you're kind of looking for, something that I commonly like to do is just take a tree and lower it until it looks like a bush, and this actually works surprisingly well, and so far it hasn't really disappointed me too much. Now, I would like to have a couple of slightly larger shrubs in here, so I like to get ornamental shrubs for that. Take either the Asian moon or the honeycomb for that, get a tiny bit of color into this area as well. I always like to place those things, and yeah, Asian moon should be fine too. There we go. That works alright. And let's see. There could be a little bit more variation in here, like there's ferns all over the place. Might want to remove a couple to see how that looks. Tiny bit of variation in ground shrubbery. Because like I said, having too much variation and different types of trees and combinations when it comes to like the higher foliage isn't really the best thing to have. But when it comes to the ground shrubbery, that's just a perfect thing. So yeah, that's what I would say. Have as much of variation in the ground shrubbery as you can, but keep it limited for the trees. And now it all just comes down to what you can find and what you think looks good. You can kind of just place these things. And when you're done with all that smaller shrubbery, one very important step that actually makes a lot of difference is to get PB&J's beach fence set. And this set has some grass in it, and we're not going to use this as actual grass. I've seen some people try that, I think, but it doesn't really work too well since it's not a realistic grass set, and it is just, well, beach grass anyway. But it does work amazing as a foliage blender, since what it essentially kind of does is, when you look at the foliage right now, it's just really in a straight line. You just have no foliage over here, but then suddenly over here there's all types of foliage and a really dense forest like that. And we kind of don't want the transition to be that harsh, so always like to place these things kind of around it, with the larger big lush ones just kind of within the forest, and then just kind of add some mediums around that to, you know, start off with the really large ones in the forest and then just kind of slow it down with some really small ones at the end. And for that I always like to take the lush sparse and then just kind of scatter that around this area. And as you can see, it really makes the forest a lot less harsh and just kind of adds a transition from the empty grass into the forest that we have over here. One very important thing when it comes to ground shrubbery is to keep it in clusters. Don't place your ground shrubbery in a very grid-like way everywhere, but just cluster some ground shrubbery here and there and keep some more empty areas in between that, and it's bound to look a lot more natural. So something like that I think looks pretty good. There's still a couple of large grass things that I kind of want to get rid of, since as you can see it does have a very light texture, so for that reason I always like to keep it very limited as well when it comes to those really large grass clusters. Something like that looks slightly better, yeah. And this isn't really the most realistic looking thing, like I said, but as you can see it is really a very narrow tree line, but when you look at it from the side it looks like there's an enormous forest over here, and that's basically why this kind of works. Now, just like over here, you know, sometimes you have these very small areas where you'd like to have a tree or two, but there's no room for anything else. It kind of works in the same way, except you don't have to use a tree line. Never ever use a tree line in the middle of your park where you're bound to notice it, since that is also quite immersion breaking. So for this thing right here, just in the middle of your park, if you have one small spot where you want to have some simple foliage, just take like the type of tree that you want to have over there. I would say that a black locust can actually work quite nice over here. Or this thing. Probably this thing, yeah. So that thing over there, then I don't know what I would want to have next to that. I feel like there's still a tiny bit of space that I can use here. Let's get spices trees for that. And get some simple, well, just a birch action over here. That should work fine. Actually, no, I already have many birches over here. Let me remove some birches over there. A birch, by the way, is a tree that you should use sparingly. It's not like you can make forests out of that. And yeah, over here, same deal. Start off with the large shrubbery and work your way down to the very smallest shrubbery, like the very small patches of grass like that. So I would like to have some apple trees around this, kind of like that, though slightly higher. There we go. And no flowers, by the way. Stuff like this is not where you can randomly add flowers. Flowers is something that I would like to make a future video about, but just as a heads up right now, don't place flowers in the middle of nowhere unless they are flowers that can grow in the wild, since you have to maintain those things, and this doesn't really look like the place where you would regularly maintain flowers. So keep your flower usage to next to the paths and not in the middle of a forest, like I said, unless it looks like a flower that can grow in the wild. Something like this. It's really hard to judge that, but something like this could work in the middle of a forest, but tulips wouldn't really work. Okay, So in any case, I should have some larger shrubbery over here. I think I can just get ornamental shrubs for that again. Haven't really used this thing yet. And that should work alright. There we go. One awesome thing as well is probably to get some larches around this thing. Let's see, some of these. And I always like to lower these so you have some very, very small pine trees next to it. And at this point, I feel like that's actually good enough to start mixing some shrubbery. That is after I get maybe like one fern. Yeah, there we go. And it's time for some beach grass, and then we should be done around here. Just a tiny bit of big lush beach grass. And some medium lush shrubs. Just kind of around that, but really keep it to a minimum. And some very small lush sparse ones, because I always like to use those. Just to kind of blend that in, and that should be good. One last touch that I also like to add, whenever you have an area where there isn't as much foliage as kind of around that area, I always like to get some tiny bit of dirt in there. Let's see, would this work? That's kind of light. I would say something like this would be better. Just some very slight variations in the ground texture. Not really a foliage thing, but I always like to get that in when you have an area that's completely empty and devoid of much other foliage. So that's it for doing basic foliage, and like I said, there are many different combinations of trees that you can use, and it really depends on what you think looks best for your specific coaster or area. But this is kind of the basic way that I like to work around it. One other thing that I like to do usually is, after it's all done, look at the tree line and see if there's not anything that I can kind of want to remove since it looks a tiny bit dense. Like over here there's a tree over here that I think is just a little bit too much, tiny bit dense over here. Like to remove that one as well, and with that I feel like it looks a tiny bit better. Also, I like to keep my tree lines a tiny bit dynamic. Don't just make them completely straight tree lines, and don't just have forests with just trees. There are always some kind of curves where the tree line either curves or where you have some larger open spaces within the forest, but that's really something to kind of mess around with. I think it's a good time to start looking at some example foliage. Alright, so this was my Christmas special coaster, but even though this is in a completely different climate, very northern climate, which means that you have these very large pines with high stems and things like that, still the same basic principle of making the foliage works over here. And if you zoom out, you can kind of see that, since even though it is really just pines over here, behind all of this foliage we have the same basic tree line over here with Old Spice's trees, and before that we have the larger trees over here and the ground shrubbery actually using the same bush over here next to the roller coaster. And even though this is not a very large tree line, there aren't really that many trees before the empty grassland starts. Nowhere in this entire coaster can you see those empty grasslands behind all of these trees, so that's kind of how that works. As you can see, even though I took different trees for this and different shrubs, it still works in the same way, and it was also built in the same way, with starting that tree line around the sides, then adding the larger pines to make that realistic looking forest that you normally have around the polar circle, and then add the small ground shrubbery around the roller coaster, and that's how that all works. And last but not least, an Asian park that I'm working on, well, even though this is a completely different climate and yet again used many different trees, it still works in a similar way, since as we kind of look at the back of this, lo and behold, there is the mad sugar maples and the hickories behind there. And over here we have the larger trees, where actually there is quite a large amount of trees over here, but that was just because I had some Japanese stereotypes in my head, thinking I need cherry trees anyway. That's beside the point. Some larger trees over here, and then just close to this pond and close to the roller coaster, I have the ground shrubbery, and that's how that all works. So this type of foliage is really not that hard to do. Just place the tree lines, place the trees, and place the ground shrubbery. It doesn't take that much time, but it really looks pretty good until you look closer and it turns out that it isn't quite as realistic as you think it is. From the side it looks very realistic, and yeah, that's just kind of my way of doing foliage. Actually, that makes it sound like I came up with all this. Definitely not true. This is just kind of evidently the most easy and also poorly light way of doing foliage in Roller Coaster Tycoon 3 that saves time and saves your computer and looks good in the meantime. So I hope you guys learned something from this tutorial, even though it wasn't as well prepared as I maybe hoped it would have been, and I wasn't really sure how to exactly do it for foliage. I'll do some future tutorials, and if you have any questions about any given theme or way of doing it, don't hesitate to ask, and I might do a tutorial on it too. In any case, thank you guys for watching, and see you guys later.